So here we are in Lent, and Lent is, as you've heard, a good season to look at the unvarnished truth about ourselves. Christiana led us in that already this morning. The unvarnished truth. To be honest and to reflect, and where necessary, to repent, which just means turn. It's also a good time to reprioritize, to remind ourselves about the good things, the things that really matter to us, the things that bring us life. Lent can be a time of simplification, to focus on those good things. So in keeping with that, this congregation has a bit of a double theme this Lent. Some of us are either individually or in groups listening to Hilary McBride's podcast, Holy Hurt, a series about spiritual trauma and healing. And we're doing that to bring the topic out into the open, to name it, to acknowledge it, to confess it, and hopefully reduce the likelihood of its happening in our midst. At the same time, from the pulpit, we're working our way through a series on early Genesis, that by which I mean the first 11 chapters of Genesis, everything before Abraham, the pregame show. And we're discovering the incredibly beautiful good news that early Genesis proclaims about God, about the world, and about what it means to be human. This second theme, this more positive theme, we're thinking of as getting back to the basics. And we're doing that because, alongside acknowledging our brokenness, we need to remember that flourishing is what we were made for. Beauty and love and delight and side-by-side companionship. That's what early Genesis proclaims for us. Those are the basics we need to get back to. So with that as a background, let's continue with this Lenten sermon series, which is already in progress, as they say on television, because this series actually started before Lent, secretly. It was the Lenten series that started before Lent. And just how are we doing in this series? Well, we started in late January. We're now in March. This is basically the fourth sermon in the series, and we're still on Genesis chapter 1. That's how we're doing. How did we get not very far? How did that happen? Well, we started by looking at how Christians so often get early Genesis only completely wrong, resulting in everything from silliness to foolishness to hurt. And then we looked at the first creation of the story in Genesis, focusing on how it contrasted with the typical ancient Near Eastern creation stories that were around at that time. Then I told you a story about Cinder Girl that started in a familiar way, but then broke out into new and surprising territory for a purpose. It had a message, and I did that so that we could experience the emotional arc that the ancient Israelites would have experienced as they listened to stories that they thought they knew. Oh, a creation story, we know that. Oh, a flood story, we know that. But then these stories broke out into new and surprising territory with all sorts of radical messages about, and here we go again, God and the world and what it means to be human. Today we're going to finally finish Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to explore two more things before we move on. Two more things that will help us get back to the basics. Actually, it's a 3-point sermon, but we're exploring two things with an epilogue. So there you go. The first thing we're going to look at is the temple imagery that is found in Genesis chapter 1. The second thing we're going to look at is the reference to Sabbath. And what we'll see with those two things is that the temple imagery communicates that all of creation is sacred space. Not just a special building here or there, not just a special room in a special building, all. And the second point, Sabbath, communicates that we, as image bearers, are invited to join God in resting, to delight in the sacred space that is everywhere. And that will bring us, as we put those two things together, to the epilogue, not the third point, the epilogue, on what I call Sabbath verbs. So, temple imagery, Sabbath, Sabbath verbs. That's where we're headed. We'll start with the temple imagery. And if you're at all familiar with Genesis chapter 1, and you are, there were the 6 days of creation, and on the seventh day God rested. If I were to read it aloud to you right now, you would say, why are we talking about temple imagery? There isn't any. And you would be right. Kind of. Because what was obvious to the ancient Israelites 3,000 years ago in a very different culture is no longer obvious to us 21st century types today. They saw temple imagery and we don't. So we need some help. So, with the help of several Old Testament scholars, but especially John Walton, who's an ancient Near East specialist, I'm just going to tell you two ways that the ancient Israelites would have heard obvious references to the idea of a temple. The first is just in the structure of the story itself. Just the shape of the story would have communicated to the ancient Israelites that this was a temple inauguration story. Okay, what does that mean? What did they know that we don't know? Here's what they knew. They knew that the typical ancient Near Eastern temple inauguration, and I want you to think of that as something like a grand opening. So it's not the construction, but the grand opening. That inauguration often took place over 7 days, as various items were ritually placed into the temple each day. And the last thing to be put into the temple was the physical image of the god. And at that point, the temple was thought to be functioning. It was open. At that point, the god was thought to be at rest in the temple. That was a typical grand opening ceremony for a new temple. So think about what happens in Genesis 1 with that in mind. The creation story takes place over 7 days. And the last thing to be put in place is the image of God. That's us. And then God rests. It's a temple inauguration story. So that's the first temple reference. Here's the second. And it's found, strangely enough, in something that is not said. You know in Harry Potter where they won't say the name? There's something like that that happens in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 simply will not use the words sun and moon. I mentioned this before, maybe you've noticed it. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. Who talks like this? Oh, it was a beautiful greater light set. Weren't there Hebrew words for sun and moon? And if there were, why didn't they use them? It would have been a lot more efficient. What's happening here? And of course, there were ancient Hebrew words for sun and moon, but they sounded very, very close to the common names for the ancient Near Eastern sun god and moon god. So it's kind of like, don't say the name. So instead, the text uses a Hebrew word that gets translated great lights, greater light, lesser light. But what we're losing in the English translation is this. That Hebrew word is used throughout the rest of the Old Testament to describe the lamps in the temple. So even though it would be awkward, and no one would really do it, Genesis 1 could be translated this way. God made two great temple lamps. The greater temple lamp to govern the day, and the lesser temple lamp to govern the night. And that does two things. First, we've already mentioned, it avoids the name of the sun god and the moon god, which sends a message. We don't worship the sun or the moon or the sun god or the moon god. But also, if the sun and the moon are temple lamps, that means by extension that the whole world is God's temple. The whole world. Everywhere. We are image bearers in that temple But that temple is everywhere. God can rest in the temple everywhere. That is a powerful, and back then, completely shocking proclamation about the ultimate goodness of everywhere. The whole world is sacred space. Not just a little safe place here or there. Notice, Genesis 1 is saying there isn't a sacred space carved out from an otherwise secular world. Even way back then, early Genesis was rejecting this thing we still struggle with today, the dichotomy between sacred and secular. Genesis 1 rejects that. We've heard before the saying, all truth is God's truth. Even way back then, early Genesis was saying something similar, but it was this: all space is God's space. Which means that early Genesis invites the ancient Israelites to see the sacred in the everyday, to see the sacred in the everywhere, to see the sacred even in the so-called mundane. That's our first point. Temple imagery, proclaiming that the whole world is good, the whole world is sacred space, and that is one of the basics we need to get back to. There's no part of this world that is disposable. The second point concerns Sabbath. And we need to start with something that is often forgotten, but I think that's optimistic, because I think actually it's never talked about at all. We can't forget it if we were never told it. And that is this: we are invited by the scriptures to think about the creation stories, plural, and the law together. We think of them as so separate. But it wasn't just the 10 Commandments that Moses brought down off Mount Sinai. He also brought good news in the form of God's covenant, God's relationship with the Israelites, and Moses brought the worldview stories that are found in early Genesis. It all arrives at the same time for the Israelites. Genesis is the first book of what is called the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books in the Old Testament, sometimes referred to as the Law of Moses, the whole thing. And we see in the Bible phrases like, as taught by Moses, according to Moses. The point is, in Moses, all of those things arrive at the same time. Creation stories and the 10 Commandments together. I just want you to listen to 2 passages, one from Genesis, one from Exodus, and hear how these things come together. God saw all that had been made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day the Lord had finished the work of creating, so on the 7th day God rested. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it the Lord rested from all the work of creating that had been done. That's from Genesis. And now from Exodus. Therefore, remember the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. We just heard about how God made the 7th day holy. Keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but God rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I just want you to hear how the creation stories and the 10 Commandments are all wrapped up together and talked about all together. And in both of them, Sabbath, this idea of Sabbath, is deeply important. And then I want you to think about how astonishing that idea of Sabbath is. I know I've said this before, but just once again, imagine that you were God and that you had to make a top 10 list of laws to turn escaped slaves into a people, into a community of human beings living their best lives. Don't murder would probably make your list. Trying to create a good community. Don't lie. Don't covet. These make sense. But be honest with me. Would this really be on your top 10 list? Hey, everybody, just stop and rest once a week. Top 10? Maybe top 100? Maybe additional guidance? But a law? But that's what happened. After being told they were image bearers, the Israelites were then invited, actually commanded, to join in God's rest on the Sabbath. This is world-changingly important. World-changingly, no matter what I did, just kept being red in my document. Just all highlighted in red. It did not approve. But it is world-changingly important. Because of this, listen to what's being proclaimed. Our worth does not come from our work. Work can bring us joy, absolutely, and richness into our lives, into the lives of others, but God's approval and God's love is not dependent on our productivity, is not dependent on our being a bowl that isn't cracked. We have value because of who we are. Image bearers and God's children. Because of who we are, not because of how much we accomplish. We don't have to work to earn worth and dignity. It's simply, says early Genesis, the way things are. Because that's how God set things up. Everyone is worthwhile. Everyone should be treated with equal dignity. I'm not sure that we can properly imagine how strange and radical and deeply healing that would have been for recently freed Israelite slaves. All they had known for generations was that you had worth only if you were working, only if you were productive. And after that, you were disposable and thrown away. But the Sabbath proclamation is so radically different. You don't have to work to be worthwhile. You already are. And that's life-changing not just for the underprivileged, it's also life-changing and unsettling for the privileged. As an example, in our era, there is a tribe of humans that I call the resume people. You know these people. Every so-called conversation with one of them is really just them updating you on their already impressive resume. They do important things. They know important people. They tell you about it. The resume people are just like the ancient Near Eastern people who predated them by about 3,000 years. They are living in a delusion. They believe the good impressions they make on others, they believe their wealth and their power and their success all really earn them their worth and their dignity. They might look rich, the resume people, but they are deeply impoverished because they need Sabbath. They need to do what God calls us all to do and commanded the ancient Israelites to do. Stop. Breathe. Rest. Just be in the world. For a moment, on a regular basis, no working, no earning, just being children of God who can stop and receive the gift of the world. So through Sabbath, we humans are called to join God in resting. We're made in God's image, early Genesis says. God rests, so we rest. And that's the second point, the second basic we need to get back to. So now let's put the two together. The whole world is God's temple, and we are called to be image bearers and to rest in that sacred space of the world. God rests. But God does a lot more than that. And if we are indeed made in the image of God, and if we are to live it all out fully, we should also pay attention to what else God does in the Genesis creation stories. We see a verb resting, but we see other verbs too. And this begins a section on what I call the Sabbath verbs. And I'll try to make my case, and you might not like it. In the creation stories, we find that God is, besides resting, also creating, seeing, naming, knowing, this is a bit of a stretch, loving, it's implied, and delighting. That's just straight out there. So we're going to go through those 6 verbs quickly. I promise you, quickly. Creating. Just think about what it means. God creates the world. Okay? Why? You ever stop and think about that? Did God have to? Was it an accident? Was God clearing up the dishes from the dining room and tripped on the way back to the kitchen and oh, there's the world? No. Creation took place simply because God wanted a completely unnecessary world to be. And if you think of it that way, you realize God is an artist. Seeing, the next verb. God sees that creation is good. This is very important. God doesn't say that creation is good and then insist that everyone else say it too. Because I said so, that's why. God sees goodness. The world is good. The goodness is there and God sees it. Third, naming. God names the various things that have been created. And later, we humans, as image bearers, are called to join in that process and name the creatures. Fourth, knowing. God does come to know the newly created humans, for better and for worse. Humans come to know God, to know nature, and to know each other. In fact, we're even told in a kind of a symbolic way that knowing is an act of love in Genesis. It's an act of love, not an act of power. Speaking of love, that's the next verb, loving. In the second creation story of Genesis, so I'm cheating a little, God is genuinely concerned that the man is alone. And then God does something about it. Over and over again, in fact, in early Genesis, we find God choosing reconciliation over rejection. Even when people behave very, very badly in early Genesis, and it doesn't take long for that to happen, God keeps loving. God stays loyal. God continues to provide. And finally, delighting. God clearly delights in what has been created. In Genesis chapter 1, we hear over and over again, good, 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 and then it ends with very good. In chapter 2, we come across the word Eden, which in Hebrew is connected with the word for delight. The garden of delight. So God's resting on the seventh day can be seen as making time to delight in the world, to rest in the temple of this whole world. And through the Sabbath, we humans are called to join God in all of these, what I call Sabbath verbs. We're made in God's image. God does these things. So on the Sabbath, we too are called to stop and make time to do the things that mark us as distinctly human, made in the image of God. We're called to not just rest, but to create, to see, to name, to know, to love, and to delight in God's good creation. These are Sabbath verbs, and I call them Sabbath verbs because they don't describe hard labor or toil, you'll notice. They don't describe things we're doing to earn our worth. According to early Genesis, these verbs are what we do when we are most fully ourselves, which is what I meant by being fully human. We do these things when we remember we are image bearers. That God does these things. We're invited to join and do these things. These beautiful things, taking time to stop and see and name and delight. That's getting back to the basics. That's the wonderful big picture that early Genesis holds out for us. We live in a good, big, beautiful, not perfect world. The whole world is sacred space. I'm going to add this. The world is what some of the ancients called a mystery. I'll put a capital M on that. By which they meant not something that we'll never know, but something we'll never stop getting to know. Think about the difference. Oh, well, we'll never know, is one thing. We'll never stop learning more and more and more. That's mystery. The world is an infinitely interesting, good, sacred mystery. And as image bearers, we are called to explore it, to see it, name it, know it, love it, to delight in it, to rest in it as a gift. That is what makes us fully human. And remember that early Genesis proclaims this is for all of us. Not just the resume people, all of us. No one is disposable. No one can be treated as if they had less value than others. This was radical news then. Unfortunately, it's still radical news now. Which gets us back to the idea that we need to remember. This good news is the compass we keep forgetting to look at. We forget God is everywhere, as we all said together. We forget the whole world is God's temple. We forget that every single one of us is an image bearer. We forget that we have value not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And when we do forget these things, among other things, that's when holy hurt can happen. When we take our eye off the compass. So during this Lent, let us reset our priorities. Let us allow early Genesis to remind us of the core truths that lie at the very heart of the gospel. And here they are again. We've already said them together. God is love. The world is gift. Every person is art. Amen.